The champagne glasses sparkled under the chandeliers, and I stood there like a ghost. Everyone in the luxury yacht club was laughing, clinking glasses, celebrating my younger brother's big night. Daniel had just been promoted in the Navy, his third commendation in less than 5 years, and my parents were throwing what looked like a black tie coronation rather than a party. I shifted my weight, feeling my heels dig into the thick carpet. I was 32 years old, standing in a room full of people who had no idea what I'd been doing with my life. I wasn't sure my parents even knew, not really. "Can I have everyone's attention?" My father, Richard Benton, boomed into the microphone. He looked every bit the successful defense contractor. Perfect tucks, slicked back silver hair, confidence pouring off him like expensive cologne. Mom stood next to him in a shimmering navy dress, holding her champagne flute high. "To Daniel," my father said, his voice warm and commanding. "The pride of this family, the true Benton legacy." The crowd erupted in cheers. Daniel, in his crisp uniform, smiled and nodded like the perfect golden boy he'd always been. My parents adored him. Annapolis grad, football captain, future military leader. Meanwhile, I had become the family's invisible footnote, the one who never quite fit the mold. "And because Daniel is not just a man of service, but a man of vision," my father continued, "we are pleased to present him with something to kickstart his future business ventures." I watched in silence as my mother pulled out a glossy folder, the kind you might expect to hold deeds and bank documents. Dad grinned at Daniel. "A trust fund, $1.3 million. The applause and gasps filled the room like a wave. I sipped my warm champagne to keep from choking. Daniel hugged our mother, thanking them with that polished charm he inherited from Dad. I stood a few feet away, feeling like the only one not included in the frame. Then came the punchline. Dad's eyes scanned the room until they landed on me. He chuckled into the mic. "And who knows? Maybe one day, Eliza will give us something to celebrate." The room tittered nervously, like people weren't sure if they were allowed to laugh at me or not. My stomach dropped. My face felt hot, but I forced a smile, the kind that hides the sting. It was just another jab in a lifetime of them. Another public reminder that I wasn't the child who made them proud. The noise of the party swirled around me, distant and hollow. I set my glass down on a tray and slipped toward the edge of the room, trying to blend into the shadows. And that's when I saw her, Aunt Lorraine. She was seated near the bar, a glass of whiskey in hand, watching me intently. Her gaze wasn't pitying. It was sharp, deliberate, almost electric. When our eyes met, she gave me the faintest nod, as if to say, "Stay steady. This night isn't over." For the first time all evening, I felt something other than humiliation. I felt a flicker of anticipation, as though my aunt had a card up her sleeve that no one else saw coming. Growing up in Annapolis felt like living inside a museum of military glory. Our house was full of polished brass and framed photos of men in uniform, mostly Dad's father and uncles, all decorated Navy men. Every dinner conversation was about strategy, honor, or whatever big contract Benton Defense Systems had just landed with the Pentagon. I used to sit at that long mahogany table, my knees barely reaching the seat edge, and listen to them praise Daniel for how focused he was. Even at 12, he was already on the fast track. Perfect posture, perfect grades, quarterback on the junior football team. "Our future admiral," Dad would say with a grin. Then there was me. I was the creative one, which was their polite way of saying the disappointment. I filled spiral notebooks with poems and made up stories about girls who wanted more than the world allowed them. When I read one of my poems aloud at a middle school assembly and won a state writing contest, Mom's reaction was, "That's nice, Eliza, but what about your math grade?" Nothing I wrote ever seemed to matter. I'd come home waving certificates from literary competitions, and they'd end up shoved in a drawer while Daniel's football trophies had a dedicated glass case in the living room. The only person who saw me was Aunt Lorraine. Lorraine was Mom's older sister, but they couldn't have been more different. Where Mom polished her pearls and hosted Navy wives' luncheons, Lorraine was a retired political science professor who wore bright scarves and read banned books just for fun. She'd show up at family holidays with a bottle of whiskey and a stack of novels for me, saying things like, "Read this one and tell me what the author is really afraid of." She was the one who told me I had a voice worth hearing, even when everyone else rolled their eyes. When I was 17, I got into a competitive summer writing program in New York. Dad refused to pay for it. "You're better off learning something practical," he'd said, sliding a brochure for a Navy prep course across the table. Lorraine paid for the program herself. I still remember her dropping me off at the dorms in Manhattan. She pressed a notebook into my hands, the first page inscribed with her looping handwriting. "Don't apologize for the way you see the world." But by the time college came around, their pressure wore me down. I got into a top MFA program for creative writing, my dream, but Mom and Dad staged what felt like an intervention. "Writing isn't a career," Mom said. "It's a hobby. You need stability, a salary." Daniel, of course, had a full ride to the Naval Academy, which only added fuel to the fire. Every dinner turned into a comparison I couldn't win. Finally, I caved. I switched my acceptance and enrolled in a marketing program. That decision felt like swallowing broken glass. After graduation, Dad pulled strings to get me a job at a government contracting firm. I spent my 20s writing corporate reports about missile components I didn't care about. My soul withered a little more each year, but every time I mentioned leaving, Dad would remind me, "Real adults don't chase dreams." The only bright spots were the late-night calls from Lorraine. She'd ask about my writing, and I'd lie at first, tell her I was too busy, but she'd always see through it. "Don't let them bury you under their expectations, kid," she'd say. "You're not them, and thank God for that." By 30, I couldn't take it anymore. I quit the job, burned out, and numb. My parents called it a reckless move. Daniel, now a decorated officer, didn't even comment. He didn't need to. His mettle spoke louder than anything I could ever say. And yet, through all of it, Aunt Lorraine never stopped believing I had something worth sharing. She was the only one who reminded me that I wasn't invisible. At least, not to her. My apartment in Baltimore is small enough that I can reach the kitchen sink from the couch. Some days that feels like a failure, but most days it feels like freedom. I left the sterile marketing job 2 years ago, trading business casual outfits and gray cubicles for a desk wedged between a thrift store bookshelf and a window that barely closes. It was the first real choice I made for myself in years. Money is tight. I pay my rent with a patchwork of ghostwriting gigs, memoirs for minor politicians, self-help books for influencers who can't string 3 sentences together. It pays just enough to keep the lights on. On Tuesday evenings, I run a free creative writing workshop at the public library for teenagers. That's the one thing that keeps me from sinking. Watching them write, really write, reminds me why I ever picked up a pen. 3 weeks ago, I got an email from the literary agent I'd pinned all my hopes on. A polite rejection. She said my novel lacked commercial appeal, which felt like a fancy way of saying, "This isn't worth selling." I read that email over and over until the words blurred. Max tried to comfort me, but he doesn't really get it. We've been together 5 months, long enough for him to have keys to my place, but not long enough for him to understand what writing means to me. He's a tech recruiter, all breezy optimism and problem-solving slogans. "There are more agents out there," he said, handing me a cup of coffee like that would fix everything. "You just need to cast a wider net." I smiled, but inside I wanted to scream. Writing isn't like fishing. It's not about a bigger net. It's about your whole soul being on the page, and someone deciding if that's worth reading. When the invitation to Daniel's promotion party arrived, I almost threw it away. I didn't want to stand there as the underachieving sister, the one with no medals, no $1 million trust fund, nothing impressive to report. But some part of me, maybe the part that still wants Dad to look at me and actually see me, said yes. I spent hours figuring out what to wear, finally settling on a navy dress I found at a secondhand store. It fit, but barely. I looked in the mirror, wondering if I could pass for someone my parents wouldn't pity. The drive to the yacht club felt like heading into enemy territory. I rehearsed small talk, bracing myself for questions I didn't want to answer. Still doing your little writing thing? Any plans to get a real job again? Those are their favorite lines, delivered with tight smiles as if they're helping. By the time I pulled into the parking lot, I told myself I didn't care what they thought. But that was a lie. A part of me still wanted just one moment of recognition. One glance from my parents that said, "You're enough, Eliza." Instead, I got the hollow toast and that cruel joke. And I realized, standing there with my untouched champagne, that I'm not invisible because they don't see me. I'm invisible because I keep hoping they will. I'd barely stepped into the main hall when I caught the looks. Not harsh ones, worse. Those tight, polite smiles that said, "Oh, you came." My dress, a navy wrap I'd found for $20 at a thrift store, suddenly felt like a costume. Everyone else shimmered in silk and tailored suits, the kind of effortless wealth I could never fake. "Eliza, there you are," Mrs. Callahan, one of Mom's oldest friends, called out, her pearls glinting under the lights. "Are you back in the corporate world yet? Or still doing that writing thing?" I forced a smile. "Still writing." She tilted her head, like she was examining a puppy with a limp. "Oh, well, that's sweet. But I'm sure your parents are hoping you'll get back to a real job soon. Something stable." I nodded politely, pretending her words didn't sting. As I moved through the crowd, I felt like I was being nibbled to death by tiny insults. Another man, some retired general, asked me if I'd finally gotten over the artist phase. A woman I barely knew asked if I'd tried influencer marketing, since that's basically writing too, right? Then my mother appeared, her expression tightening as soon as she saw me. "Darling," she said, kissing the air near my cheek. "That dress. It's charming. Next time, let me lend you something more refined. It's a special evening, you know." I swallowed my pride. "Sure, Mom." "Smile more," she added in a whisper, already glancing toward Daniel's fiancée, who was surrounded by admirers and looked like a porcelain doll in pale gold satin. I lasted another 10 minutes, dodging questions about my love life and my income, before I slipped down a side hallway. I found the yacht club's library, a quiet, wood-paneled room with shelves that smelled like dust and lemon oil. Closing the door behind me, I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. My eyes landed on a stack of old scrapbooks on a side table. Curiosity tugged at me. I flipped one open and froze. Inside were copies of my childhood poems, typed pages I hadn't seen in years. Someone had saved them. There were even old snapshots of me reading at middle school contests, awkward and gangly, but beaming. I sank into a chair, the edges of my throat tightening. I had always assumed my parents had tossed those things out, but here they were, preserved like they meant something. Found something worth remembering? I looked up. Aunt Lorraine stood in the doorway, leaning on her cane, her scarf a riot of turquoise and red. Her eyes, sharp and knowing, softened as she saw what I was holding. "You kept these?" I asked. "I kept everything they didn't bother to," she said, stepping inside. "You were the only one of us brave enough to say what you felt. Don't let the noise drown your voice." I blinked, caught off guard. "What do you mean?" Her lips curved into the faintest smile. "I need you sharp tonight, Eliza. Pay attention." Before I could ask more, She patted my shoulder and walked back toward the hallway. Confused, I closed the scrapbook and followed her lead. By the time I returned to the ballroom, my father was already at the microphone, clearing his throat for yet another speech. I had no idea what Lorraine was planning, but for the first time that night, I felt a flicker of hope. My father had just finished bragging about Daniel's promotion for the third time when Aunt Lorraine rose from her seat. She didn't wait for applause or for my father to hand her the microphone. She simply walked up, leaning on her cane, her scarf trailing like a banner. The crowd quieted as she stood beside him. "Richard," she said calmly, "you've done enough talking tonight. Let me say a few words." My father, caught off guard, chuckled. "Lorraine, this is Daniel's night." "Yes, and I intend to honor him. But I also intend to speak the truth, which you rarely do when it comes to this family." The silence that followed was electric. She turned toward the crowd, her voice steady but warm. "Daniel, my dear, I am proud of you," she began. "Your service and courage speak for themselves, and I'll always admire your discipline. But there is another kind of courage in this family, one that has gone unrecognized for too long." I froze. She was looking directly at me. "My niece, Eliza," Lorraine continued, her tone rising slightly, "has shown a bravery that no medal can measure. While the rest of this family chased titles and contracts, she chose something harder: truth. She writes. She teaches underprivileged teenagers to write. She's been building something meaningful, even when no one in this room cared enough to notice." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. My face burned, but I couldn't look away from her. "She has given more to the spirit of this world than any trust fund could ever buy," Lorraine went on. "And speaking of trust funds," she paused, letting the silence build. "It's time this family learned that success isn't just uniforms and bank accounts. I'm leaving the bulk of my estate, yes, all 15 million of it, to establish the Benton Literary Initiative. Its mission will be to support young writers from communities that have been silenced too long. And Eliza will serve as its founding director." Gasps erupted like someone had dropped a bomb in the ballroom. Someone near the bar actually dropped a glass, the shatter punctuating the moment. I blinked, stunned. Did I hear her right? 15 million? I wasn't sure if my heart was pounding from shock or the tidal wave of emotions that hit me all at once: gratitude, disbelief, fear. My mother's face went pale, her hand gripping the stem of her champagne glass so tightly I thought it might break. My father's jaw tightened as he muttered something under his breath that I couldn't catch. Daniel's fiancée looked like she'd just swallowed a lemon. Lorraine smiled faintly, letting the whispers swell before she concluded. "It's time this family saw what I've always seen in you, Eliza. A voice that deserves to be heard." I felt everyone's eyes on me, but I couldn't speak. My throat had closed. My aunt's gaze softened when it met mine, like she was silently saying, "This is your moment. Own it." I managed a small nod, unable to hold back the tears stinging my eyes. For once, I wasn't invisible. I wasn't the afterthought. The crowd was still buzzing as Lorraine handed the microphone back to my father, who looked like someone had pulled the rug out from under him. He didn't even try to hide his discomfort, but Lorraine didn't flinch. She just stepped down, her expression calm and resolute. The hierarchy of the Benton family had just been turned upside down, and I wasn't sure if any of us would ever recover from it. The moment the speeches ended, my father motioned for me and Aunt Lorraine to follow him. His jaw was set like a steel trap as he led us down a quiet hallway to his office inside the club. The door closed with a heavy thud, shutting out the chatter and music. "What in God's name was that?" he barked, pointing at Lorraine like she was an unruly guest. "Hijacking Daniel's night to announce some vanity project?" Lorraine set her cane against the wall and calmly took a seat in one of the leather chairs. "It's not a vanity project, Richard. It's my estate, and I'm leaving it to something that matters. You embarrass this family," my mother snapped, crossing her arms. You embarrassed Daniel. And Eliza, she turned on me, her voice sharp. Did you know about this? Did you put her up to this stunt? I shook my head, still too stunned to form words. I didn't, I managed to say. My father's eyes drilled into me. Then why didn't you stop her? This literary nonsense is not the Benton way. We build things that matter. Industries, legacies, national security. Not sentimental little art projects. Lorraine's eyes narrowed. You think missiles and contracts are the only legacy worth leaving? You have no idea how much your daughter has already given. Quietly, without the recognition she deserves. She's given nothing, my father shot back. She quit a stable job. She's wasting her life on scribbles. Something inside me snapped. I'd been silent my entire life, but not now. They're not scribbles, I said, my voice shaking at first but growing stronger. I teach kids who don't have anyone cheering for them. I write because it's the only way I feel alive. I'm tired of pretending that makes me less than Daniel, or less than whatever you think I should be. My mother looked like I had slapped her. My father's face hardened. You'll regret this attitude, Eliza. You're burning bridges. I met his gaze, my heart pounding. You can't burn bridges that never let you cross. For a moment, no one spoke. Lorraine broke the silence, her voice cool but firm. My decision is final. The Benton Literary Initiative will move forward with Eliza at the helm. It's already in writing, legally binding. There's nothing you can do about it. My father's fists clenched, but he didn't argue further. He just turned away, like he couldn't stand to look at me. Lorraine stood, offering me her arm. Come on, sweetheart. We have nothing left to discuss here. I slipped my hand through her arm, feeling her warmth, her steady presence. We walked out together, past the party and the forced smiles, leaving the weight of my parents' expectations behind for the first time in my life. The cool night air hit me as soon as we stepped outside. Lorraine squeezed my arm gently before heading toward the waiting car. I'll see you at home, sweetheart, she said. There's nothing more to say to them tonight. I nodded, watching her driver help her into the back seat. I was about to follow when I heard someone call my name. Eliza, wait! I turned and saw Daniel jogging toward me, his crisp uniform jacket now unbuttoned, his perfect composure cracked. For a moment, I considered walking away, but something in his face, tired, almost human, made me stop. Listen, he said, slightly out of breath. I'm sorry. About Dad. About all of that. I crossed my arms, unsure if I wanted to hear him out. You don't have to apologize for them, Daniel. It's not your job. He ran a hand over the back of his neck. Maybe not. But I should have said something. You didn't deserve that. The honesty in his tone surprised me. You're the golden child. You don't need to risk anything defending me. Golden, he repeated with a humorless laugh. You think this feels like winning? Do you know how many times I wanted to quit? I wanted to study anthropology, travel, do something that actually meant something to me. But every time I even hinted at it, they acted like I was betraying the family. I blinked. I never knew that. Of course you didn't. I played the role, the hero, the perfect son. You think all those medals and promotions feel good? They feel heavy. His voice cracked slightly, and he looked away. When you walked out with Lorraine just now, I realized, you're doing what I never could. You're choosing your own life, no matter what they say. Maybe that's real courage. I didn't know what to say. For so long, I'd envied him, resented him even. But standing there, I saw the weight in his shoulders, the way his hands fidgeted like a man trapped in his own success. I don't feel brave, I admitted. Most days I feel like I'm barely holding it together. Then maybe we both need to figure out what brave actually looks like. He gave me a small, almost shy smile. I meant what I said. I'm sorry. And congratulations. Lorraine's foundation is going to be incredible. You'll be incredible. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the urge to argue or defend myself. Thanks, Daniel. We stood there for a few seconds, awkward but not cold. Something unspoken settled between us. Not forgiveness exactly, but the first fragile thread of understanding. Go with Aunt Lorraine, he said. She's always been the smartest person in the room. As I walked toward the car, I glanced back at him, standing under the streetlight with his uniform slightly rumpled. For once, I didn't just see the golden boy. I saw my brother. The Benton Literary Initiative opened on a mild spring afternoon, sunlight spilling across the sidewalk in front of the renovated row house. It had once been a crumbling corner building, but now fresh paint gleamed on the brick, and the wide windows displayed posters of poems written by the teenagers from my library workshop. I stood at the entrance, holding my breath as the first guests stepped inside. The main room was alive with color. Handmade zines stacked on tables, lines of handwritten poetry pinned to string across the walls like laundry on a bright day. Local writers, the ones who'd volunteered as mentors, wandered the room talking to the kids who'd come for the launch. I heard bursts of laughter, nervous but proud, as the teenagers explained their stories to strangers who actually listened. Lorraine was seated in a soft recliner near the front, wrapped in a deep burgundy shawl. She looked smaller than I remembered, her energy dulled by the illness that had been slowly stealing her strength these past months. But her eyes were still sharp, still filled with that wry warmth that had carried me through my darkest years. Not bad, kid, she said when I crouched beside her chair. You turned an old row house into something that feels alive. I didn't imagine it would come together this beautifully. Neither did I admitted, my throat tight. None of this would exist without you. She gave me a knowing smile. Maybe not. But you're the one building it now. I just gave you the match. You're the one keeping the fire lit. As the event picked up, Daniel arrived with his fiancée, Claire. They slipped in quietly, both looking slightly out of place in their formal outfits. Daniel handed me a small envelope. We made a donation, he said, almost shyly, for the summer retreat you mentioned. No names attached, but, well, you'll know who it's from. I blinked at him, surprised by the softness in his voice. Thank you, I said. He glanced toward Lorraine and nodded. She'd be proud. Actually, I think she already is. Later I stood at the front of the room to speak. My hands trembled slightly, but as I looked around, I saw faces that weren't judging me. They were rooting for me. This place is for anyone who's ever been told their voice doesn't matter, I said. It's for kids who write on notebook paper in secret, who are afraid their words won't be good enough. This is proof that every voice counts. When I finished, Lorraine motioned for me to come closer. She reached into her bag and pulled out a framed page. It was an excerpt from the first short story I'd ever published, a small magazine piece about a girl who found her voice in silence. This belongs here, I told her, but she shook her head. It belongs with you, she said, to remind you where you started and where you're going. The rest of the day passed in a warm blur. Kids signed up for new writing sessions. Parents lingered to thank us, and I caught Daniel in a quiet corner reading some of the teens' poems. For the first time, I felt like I was standing in the right place, doing exactly what I was meant to do. When I locked up that evening, Lorraine was still smiling from her recliner, her eyes glassy but content. You did it, Eliza, she whispered. You're finally living your truth. Lorraine passed away quietly just a week after the launch of the foundation. I was sitting beside her when it happened, the late afternoon light streaming through her window. She looked so peaceful, her lips curved in the faintest smile, as though she had finished every task she had set out to do. The days that followed were a blur of arrangements, paperwork, and quiet grief. Her attorney handed me a bundle of letters she had left for me, each envelope labeled in her neat handwriting. For Eliza, when you doubt. For Daniel, when he's ready. For the family, if they ever ask why. The one for me also included a printed essay titled Words as Weapons. It was going to be published posthumously, she had explained. It was her manifesto, a love letter to the power of language and an unapologetic call to use one's voice, even when it shakes. The memorial was small and understated, exactly the way she would have wanted. It was held at the Foundation's new space, surrounded by the poems and zines from the teen writers she admired so much. Librarians, local authors, and a few students from my workshop filled the seats. My parents were there too, dressed in black and strangely subdued. For once, there were no sharp remarks, no posturing, only the quiet discomfort of people realizing they had underestimated the wrong woman. When it was my turn to speak, I walked to the podium with trembling hands. She taught me, I began, my voice faltering, the power of the unsaid, and the courage to say it anyway. Lorraine believed that stories are what survive us, and because of her, there will be countless stories told that might have otherwise been lost. I looked out at the small crowd. Some people were already crying softly. My eyes found Daniel's, and he gave me a small, encouraging nod. Daniel spoke briefly afterward. His voice was low, steady, but touched with something rare: vulnerability. When I was 10, Aunt Lorraine sent me a book about ancient civilizations. I didn't tell anyone, but I read it cover to cover, twice. For a moment, I dreamed of exploring the world, digging into history instead of just following orders. I never had the courage to follow that path, but knowing she believed in me, it meant more than I realized then. When the memorial ended, we stayed for a while, sharing quiet conversations with people who had loved Lorraine for who she truly was. My parents left early, offering me stiff hugs at the door, but Daniel stayed. He helped me stack the chairs and gather the letters people had written in her memory. That night, I returned to the Foundation alone. The rooms were silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchenette. I sat at the big wooden table where the teens usually wrote and opened my laptop. For years I had been too afraid to start another novel after my last rejection. But that fear felt hollow now. This wasn't about validation anymore. It wasn't about proving my worth to my family, or to anyone else. It was about telling the stories I'd been holding back for too long. I opened a blank document and began to type. The words came slowly at first, then faster, as if they had been waiting for this moment all along. Lorraine's framed note, "Don't apologize for the way you see the world," sat on the table beside me, catching the light. For the first time, I wrote not to be seen, but because I finally believed I had something worth saying.